A report from the Chicago Teachers Union described a middle school on the south side of the city with a leaky roof, outdated textbooks, and broken science equipment. Yet students there were expected to perform on the same standardized tests as their peers in well-funded suburban schools. Across the city, test scores were used not to direct additional support, but to justify cuts. A principal might sign off on a budget or assessment plan not because it seemed fair, but because the system required it. Hannah Arendt once sat through the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi officer responsible for coordinating the logistics of the Holocaust. And what shocked her wasn't his hatred or ideology, it was his lack of thought. He never questioned the orders he carried out or the consequences of those orders. He claimed he had simply done his job. Arendt wrote that his kind of evil, unremarkable, bureaucratic, and ordinary was more dangerous than we think. She called it the banality of evil. We often picture evil as something loud and angry, but Arendt saw how evil could wear a name badge, file reports, and go home by 5. She wasn't excusing Eichmann. She was warning the rest of us that when people stop thinking critically about the systems they uphold, they become part of the problem. And that includes people working in public education. Standardized testing is one of the clearest examples. These tests claim to measure knowledge, but what they often reflect is income. The National Center for Fair and Open Testing has shown how standardized tests consistently disadvantage students from poor communities and students of color. Teachers know this, and many wish they could teach differently. But when their salaries, their school's funding, and their students' futures hang on test results, they fall in line. Not because they believe it's right, but because policy says so. Zero-tolerance discipline is another place where moral detachment thrives. And these policies require automatic suspensions or expulsions for certain infractions, regardless of context. And that might sound fair in theory, but in practice it leads to disproportionate punishment for Black and brown students. A Black student might get suspended for the same behavior a white student gets warned for. But the assistant principal, following policy, checks the box and moves on. The school-to-prison pipeline isn't a conspiracy, it's a pattern created by rules, forms, and people who stop asking questions. And according to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, Black students are nearly 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students for the same offenses. That doesn't happen because teachers are cartoon villains. It happens because they're told to treat every case the same, even when the cases are not the same. And the way we fund schools only adds to the problem. In most states, school funding comes from local property taxes, and that means schools in wealthy neighborhoods get more money than those in poor ones. A recent report from the Education Trust found that districts serving mostly students of color receive about $1,800 less per student than those serving mostly white students. Principals in underfunded schools do their best, but they often accept those limits as inevitable. They write grant applications instead of protest letters. Even special education isn't spared. Federal law requires schools to provide a free, appropriate public education to students with disabilities, but interpretation varies wildly. Some schools under-identify students because they don't want to pay for services, and others over-identify to access more funding. Either way, students become data points in a system more focused on compliance than care. Teachers fill out IAPs by deadline and move on to the next. And charter schools have introduced new layers of administrative obedience. And while some provide innovation, many operate like businesses. They can counsel out students who might lower performance scores and spend public money without the same oversight. And staff often face pressure to meet metrics rather than meet needs. The language becomes technical, outputs, accountability, value added. Thought gets replaced with spreadsheets. Albert Bandura, a psychologist who studied moral behavior, called this moral disengagement. People convince themselves they're not responsible because they didn't write the rule or sign the law. And Bandura noted that when authority figures normalize harmful behavior, others will follow even when it violates their values. And that idea pairs cleanly with Arendt's. Thoughtlessness plus obedience can cause enormous harm. Educators don't start out apathetic, but over time, burnout sets in. Teachers who once wanted to make a difference find themselves trapped in systems that punish creativity and reward conformity. They follow scripts. They prioritize test prep. They avoid making waves, and without realizing it, they stop thinking. That's what Arendt feared most. And some politicians have called for the Department of Education to be dismantled. They argue that states and local districts know best, but history shows that federal oversight has been essential to progress, and without it, schools might have never been desegregated. Students with disabilities might still be excluded. Local control without accountability just gives bad systems more room to grow. There is hope, though. Teachers have refused to administer standardized tests. Principals have stood up against zero-tolerance mandates, and parents have fought for fairer funding. And these acts matter. Arendt suggested that thinking was not just an intellectual act, but a moral one. Arendt suggested that thinking was not just an intellectual act, but a moral one. To stop harm, people have to think for themselves, even when it's risky. And back in that Chicago school, the teachers knew the test scores would drop. They also knew their students deserved better. One of them rewrote the reading list to include authors who looked like the kids in the room, and another used her own money to buy science kits. They were working inside a broken system, but they refused to stop thinking. That's what separates obedience from responsibility, and it's what Arendt wanted us to remember. If you enjoyed this video, you know the drill. Like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world. And this one could be a good one to check out next.